I am Kadir van Lohuizen, and I'm a photographer and filmmaker from the Netherlands. For the past 30 years, I have covered major conflicts in the world, like in the Middle East and in Africa. But for the last 10, 15 years, I've been focused more on environmental issues and climate issues related to the climate. I'm from Amsterdam, so I live in the country which is largely below sea level. So 10 years ago, I was traveling in Latin America and working on another project where I was looking at contemporary migration in the Americas. And halfway, I came to these beautiful islands, which are called the San Blas Islands. And I interviewed people there, and they told me that they were being evacuated. So I asked them why they were being evacuated, and they told me because the sea is coming, the sea level is rising. I felt a bit naive because in the end, I am from the Netherlands, but it was actually the first time that I realized that this is a problem which exists today and is not a problem for future generations. So that was the start of a large project where I started to look into different regions in the world and see what was happening and basically to visualize the urgency to show that this is not an issue for future generations, but that this is actually an issue which exists already today. I'm working for major media, so this was initially a collaboration with the New York Times. And basically I researched different parts of the world, seeing where this is an issue already. Not easy, because how do you visualize something which is often not visual yet? So I'll take you on a small journey around the globe, where I've been working in different parts of the world, basically showing quite an alarming picture, I would say. The project is called After Us the Deluge, and basically it questions where will we go in the end. Initially, I focused on the main reason why the sea level is rising, which is the melting of the ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica mainly. Here we are in Greenland, which is obviously a lot of ice. There's about 2.5 to 3 kilometers of ice on Greenland. If that all would melt, the sea level would rise 7 meters. By the way, if Antarctica would melt, it would rise 86 meters. If you really want to see how quickly the climate is changing and how quickly it's warming up, you have to go to the Arctic. In Greenland, it's been twice now that in the summer the temperatures have been above zero, and it's even last summer it even rained on the middle of the ice sheet, which never happened before. So it's very rapid. I was able to join a scientific team on the middle of the ice sheet. Here we are at their scientific station. This is about 2,800 meters high, of which 2,500 meters is ice. And what you see is a drill. They actually drilling all the way to the bedrock. And the reason why they are doing this is because they discovered that there are ice flows, which are basically big rivers, frozen rivers, which slowly move towards the ocean, which are expediting the sea level rise. So this camp was moving about 15 centimeters a day. And these are the ice cores which are coming out. You have to imagine that the ice that you are seeing here is coming from a depth of about 1,500 meters and is about 20,000 years old. And basically in these cores, they can see basically the history of the climate of this planet. So they can determine when there was an ice age, when it was warmer, when there were major volcanic eruptions, which have covered the ice sheet. Unfortunately, every time there's a new report from the International Climate Panel, it shows a picture which is more dark than it has been before. We agreed already at the Paris Agreement that we would try to achieve that the temperature on this planet would not rise more than 1.5 degrees. But so far, it looks like we are heading for 3 degrees or even worse. Bangladesh, well, many people would say, well, what's new about Bangladesh? You know, there are always floods, there are always cyclones, which is true. But at the same time, it's a country which is one of the most densely populated in the world. There are about 160 million people, of which 50 million people in the Delta. And what they are experiencing now is normally if a cyclone would come or a storm, that it would flood, but the water would recede. And nowadays it often doesn't recede anymore, which means that the soil becomes saline, that people can't grow crops anymore, that there's no safe drinking water anymore because it's becoming brackish. So for me, that was actually where I started to realize that this problem starts much earlier than before there's permanently water in your house. Because if you can't grow your crops anymore, there's no food security, there's no safe drinking water. It's a reason for many people to leave already, and that's what's happening. You know, millions of people have left the Delta already, often coming to the cities, which means that they lost their livelihood because they used to be farmers or fishermen. They often end up in the slums of cities like Dhaka or Chittagong. Nevertheless, the government of Bangladesh has adopted a very ambitious plan to protect Bangladesh, to build new coastal enforcements, dikes, but also to enable people to build up a life if they come to the cities. But the clock is ticking. The clock is ticking everywhere, and the question is how fast can they do it, and how fast can we do it to really protect people in coastal regions. And the problem in Bangladesh is there's no high ground. It's, as I said, similar to the Netherlands. India has built a wall on the border, which means that to prevent people from crossing into India. Nevertheless, people are quite creative, because this is one of the islands in the Gulf of Bengal, and this used to be rice paddies, but due to the frequent flooding, people have turned into salt mining, and the rice paddies became salt paddies. So, you know, I would say that often in the part of the world where I'm coming from is that people look up at their governments and see what needs to be done, and expect the government to act. Often in countries like Bangladesh and also in the Pacific, people take their own measures and take their own decisions. But it is a big issue, because if people come to the cities, which are already overcrowded, they often have moved already a number of times before they have arrived in the city. And I was here in an area in Chittagong, and people were threatened to be evicted because new real estate was to be built. And the day after, when I came, the whole area went up in flames, and people had to move again. These were the islands which I was speaking about, off the coast of Panama, on the Caribbean side. I was there for the first time in 2011, and the first people were supposed to be evacuated to the mainland in the next year, but I came back in 2015, and the people were still there. There is mainland where they can go to. It's high ground, so the hospital has been built, the school has been built, but the funding for the housing has disappeared. So up till today, the people still remain on the islands. And what was interesting when I came the first time, people were really, they didn't want to leave, because I think we need to understand that leaving your the place where you used to live and leaving the place where your grandparents came from is a very difficult decision for any of us. But when I came back the second time, people were quite anxious to leave, because they really felt threatened and by the sea, and they didn't feel safe anymore. As mentioned, I really wanted to show that this issue is worldwide, and this is not only affecting a country like Bangladesh or islands in the Pacific. So obviously the United Kingdom is close to my home. It's just across the North Sea. It's the East Coast, and it's actually the fastest eroding coast in Europe. There's nothing new about erosion. Obviously, that's a very natural phenomenon. But what is new is that it's going so fast. Because of the rise of the sea level, sea currents are changing as well. So this part of England is losing 2-3 meters a year. And what you see here is the remaining part of the coastal road, which was still there a year before, but it has completely disappeared. So actually, what you see here doesn't exist anymore. What was interesting was that the UK government decided not to protect these towns and villages anymore, and that the people had to move. Well, Kiribati, as you pronounce it, is very, I don't think I've ever been so remote. It's located between Fiji and Hawaii. It's a number of atolls. It's actually a very big country. It's as big as India, but it consists mainly of ocean. And this is the main island where the capital is. It's, well, maybe 1.5–2 meters above sea level. And that's about it. So it was also a place where I really felt, I didn't feel safe, to be honest. You know, I mean, it very frequently at high tide it floods, and people do whatever they can to protect their homes. But you know, the coral reef is dying because of the warming of the ocean, and then the beach starts eroding, and then it goes very quickly. And what you see here is actually the start of the international runway of the international airport of Kiribati. And they're doing whatever they can to protect it, because it's their only lifeline to the outside world. This is a high tide. And as you can see, the children might enjoy it, but the beach is gone. And the family tried to protect their house with trunks of coconut tree and sandbags, but it floods, and again, you know, people can't grow their crops anymore. There's no safe drinking water. The previous president actually took a bold step. The government purchased land on Fiji and announced that in the future they would move the people of Kiribati to their new home on Fiji. The Fijian government at that time was not very amused, because it was not discussed with them. So officially now, the reason to purchase this land is to grow crops, to export them back to Kiribati. But it shows the urgency, and it's predicted that the islands need to be evacuated probably in 30 years or so. And really, the people don't know where to go, because it's a nation, and what do we do with a nation that disappears, and where do the people go to? What happens to their language? What happens to their culture? The Marshall Islands is quite similar. I was planning to go back to Kiribati, but I actually couldn't because there's been a new president, which has been nicknamed the Trump of the Pacific, and he denies that there's a problem. So I went to the Marshall Islands, which again has a very similar situation. The good thing is that due to the nuclear testing, which the Americans did in the 40s and the 50s on the Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands, the government gets compensated by the US financially every year. And the residents of the Marshall Islands, they can go to the US and get a residency. Many did, but many came back as well because they couldn't feel at home in the US. They felt they were losing their culture and their language. So many of them came back and choose to still live in a rather unsafe situation. I mean, as you can see, the island is very, very narrow. There's ocean on both sides. There's no beach anymore. So again, for Kiribati and the Marshall Islands, and there are a few other nations like the Maldives, Tuvalu, and a few others who will most likely cease to exist in the next few decades. Well, Miami, the city of real estate. I mean, there's still a lot of real estate is being built, but at the same time, it's a city which is seriously at risk. And the reason why it's at risk is that it's built on limestone, and limestone, in principle, is great to build on, but there's one problem, and that it's porous. So many experts, mainly Dutch experts who are on water management and coastal protection, have come to Miami to see if there could be a master plan to protect Miami. But so far, the conclusion has been that if you build a dike on limestone, that the water will just go under and will not solve the issue. So Miami, Obama called it once that Miami was ground zero for climate change, for the climate crisis, and this is tide. This is the seawater. What you see in the streets at high tide. It means that when the tide is coming up, that the water is coming up through the drainage, yes, this is what the result is. So hundreds of pumps have been installed to protect to prevent this from happening, but obviously that's not a long-term solution. So it looks like Miami is doomed and will have to be evacuated. Well, also in a few decades, which is very hard to imagine that this could happen. But there's no protection, and that's why I want to show you these few images, which are the north of Florida. When I was in Miami, there was a big hurricane was approaching the north of Florida, and I basically went there to show what happens if there's no coastal protection, because what you see is not so much the wind damage; it's the damage of a storm surge. So a storm surge of a few meters high rolled over the land and basically destroyed anything that was in its way. And that's a problem in the US. Most of the East Coast is unprotected. Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia, is a special case because Jakarta initially, for now, has a much bigger problem than a rising sea level, which is that the city is sinking. And the city is sinking because they're extracting too much groundwater. The city is very large. I mean, it grew immensely over the last few decades. It's approximately 20 million people who live in the metropole. If you use too much groundwater, the land starts to sink. So the only solution is to stop the usage of groundwater. But obviously, the water needs to come from somewhere. So a big master plan has been developed for Jakarta as well, to protect it, to close off the bay, to reclaim land, because this is currently what is every day for millions of people in the north of Jakarta, where the streets flood and people try to protect themselves with sandbags. Unfortunately, it seems that this master plan is not going to happen due to financial issues, due to bureaucratic issues, but also because of protests of people who felt that if the bay would be closed, that they lose their livelihood as fishermen. So seawalls are being built everywhere, but sometimes it doesn't really work, because obviously where the buoy is, there's not supposed to be water. So the government of Indonesia has decided that the capital of Jakarta will be relocated. Unfortunately, though, it seems that the government will relocate and not the people. So the question is, what's going to happen with all those people who will remain in Jakarta? Well, my own country was initially not included, because I really was looking for regions in the world where there's an urgency, where people experience already day to day what's happening with the rising sea level. The Netherlands is, although it's below sea level, it's probably the best protected delta in the world. We had our wake-up call back in 1953 already, when a huge storm and a very high tide came, and much of the southwest of the Netherlands flooded. 1,900 people nearly lost their lives. So since then, the dikes have been reinforced. We closed off the sea arms, so we feel safe behind our dikes and dunes. At the same time, obviously, the sea level rise doesn't take into account if you're rich or poor. It will affect us all in the end of the day. So it's been predicted now that, again, if we don't bring the temperatures down, that also the Netherlands could experience even 1 to 3 meters sea level rise by the end of the century, which is in 80 years, which means that if you are born today, that you will probably experience this. The Netherlands can deal with 1 meter sea level rise, but the Netherlands cannot deal with 2 meters or 3 meters. So there's a lot of work being done to see what needs to happen and how the Netherlands can be protected. But there is an option that the western part of the Netherlands needs to be relocated, which means that cities like Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague will have to relocate. And the question is to where? And I once made a joke that we maybe have to learn German, because I mean, in the end of the day, it's not the question if the sea level will rise 1 meter, 2 meters, 3 meter, or 5 meter. The question is when. And that's the alarming part, because when we reinforced our dikes and closed off the sea arms, that work took us 40 years. And the Netherlands is a very tiny country. So if you compare the coastline of the Netherlands to that of Bangladesh, the US, or even Korea, it's a very tiny coastline, very small, very short. So I would say maybe it's not 2:12 to midnight, but it's 2 after. And if we don't get our act together, this planet is going to face quite severe consequences with a rising sea level, where many of the coastal regions will be lost and will have to be given back to the sea, and people have to relocate. And I think part of the problem is that we are in our comfort zone. We don't really want to take a step back, but we owe this to future generations. I mean, the last 2 generations, 3 generations have experienced incredible welfare, but it's now time to take responsibility for future generations. And if it's not the governments who will do it, it's major companies who will take action by themselves. Well, I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and bye for now.